Hello, everybody, and welcome to another fun lecture on government. And today we're going to talk about, lawmaker representation and the different kind of ways that we can think about lawmakers representing people. And then I'm actually going to give you a little bit of a modern history lesson. We're going to talk about kind of the recent history of lawmaking. And kind of the irony of this is that, after last week I told you all about how a bill becomes a law. Today I'm going to tell you why that doesn't really happen anymore. And there's a lot of reasons, and I'm going to be spitting some venom in this video, so follow along and learn something. So we start off talking about the different kind of groups or ways in which we consider a lawmaker might come to a decision about a vote. So let's say, a senator's sitting there and they're trying to figure out, should I vote yes or no on this bill, and how do they go about thinking about that? And we generally classify legislators as having four ways of representing their constituents. And the first is as a trustee. And what does that mean? The legislator believes that people elected them to use their own knowledge and experience and opinion in voting. So if you are voting as a trustee, you're thinking, you know what, the people of my state or the people of my district sent me to Congress because they think I'm a smart, educated guy or gal who they trust to vote best for them. They gave me the power. This is representative democracy. I'm here to exercise my voice because I'm the person they trust to represent the voice or to represent them. And so I should just vote what I think is best. And a little different way to think about that is to think about voting as a delegate. A delegate believes they are representing the views of their constituents more directly. And so regardless of whether they might like or dislike a particular piece of legislation, they will vote how they think people in their district want them to vote. If I think the folks back home want me to vote yes, then I'm going to vote yes. And if I think the folks back home want me to vote no, I'm going to vote no, even if that conflicts with our personal views. I think a lot of people run trying to say that they're delegates. I don't know how much people actually vote like that. Delegates, I think if you ask most people, they say they want their legislators to vote as delegates, and of course they do, because that gives their own personal opinion the most power. And some people, I think, do keep this in mind when they're voting. But I think people tend to overstate the extent that they do. So then the third way is being a partisan. Well, what's a partisan? And that's pretty easy, I think. A partisan is someone who votes the way that their party leadership wants them to vote. And so a partisan, if they're in the minority and the minority leader says, well, vote no on this bill, then they're going to vote no. And if the minority leader says vote yes on this bill, then they're going to vote yes. They are just loyal to their party. I don't think many people actually run for Congress, run for the House or Senate thinking, oh yeah, I'm just going to be a partisan lackey. And, if I'm a Democrat, I'm going to vote the Democrat side 100% of the time. And if I'm a Republican, I'm going to vote the Republican side 100% of the time. Oftentimes it works out that way for two main reasons. One, because if you're, run as a Democrat, it's usually because your own views align pretty well with those of your fellow Democrats. And vice versa, if you run as a Republican, usually your views align better with those of other Republicans. And so it's easier and convenient for you to run or to vote as that party because, your party side, it happens to be your own side too. The other major reason is what we talked about last week about the power of the party leadership to kind of give carrots and sticks to people to influence their vote. And so if you continually vote not the way your party wants, if you're a Republican and the Republican leader says vote no on this and you vote yes, and then next week they say vote no on this too and you vote yes on it, you start to make your party leadership very mad. And if you make them mad, they can do things to you that can kind of take away some of your power. They can't kick you out of Congress, they can't kick you out of the House or Senate, generally speaking, but what they can do is they can take away if you happen to be a leader yourself, they can vote you out of leadership. They can take away your committee assignments. And in these ways, and the committee assignments are a very, very important kind of carrot and stick approach, because you want to be on the committees that are A, powerful, through which money goes through, and B, reflect the interest of your constituents. If you represent a farming community, you want to be on the agriculture committee. And if you represent a committee that has a military base in it, you want to be on that military affairs committee. You want to be on the committees that influence your district or your state, and the committees where there are power. And the leadership decides who's on those committees and who chairs those committees. And if you consistently defy the leadership, you will not be on those committees and you will not be chairing those committees. And so you lose a lot of your power. And therefore, with that kind of in mind, people oftentimes are reticent to defy their party leadership, because they know if they do, they're going to get in trouble. And this is especially true in Congress or in the House of Representatives, where you're only 1 out of 435 people, so your one little vote on the House floor doesn't usually make a big difference. And so your real power in the House of Representatives comes on committee assignments. And so that's, the power of the House leadership to really control their caucus is greater. A politico is someone who kind of combines all these approaches and maybe applies one or the other on a vote-to-vote basis. And you can imagine how this kind of works out in practice, that, it's not like you go and say, well, yep, I'm always going to vote exactly the way the people in my district want. You probably use these things as kind of conflicting views. Uh-oh, my computer decided to... and is giving up the ghost here. Just kidding. So, if for a politico, maybe sometimes they're like, I feel really strong about this, so I'm going to vote as a trustee. I'm going to vote my own decision. Something else, they're like, well, this really affects people in my community, so I'm really going to follow their wishes with how I vote here. And other times they might say, well, you know what, I really need to follow the party leadership here, because if I don't, then bad things are going to happen. Keep these ideas in mind as we kind of go through the next segment here. Modern challenges to lawmaking. You find that this is very common. People have the idea that governing is harder, and in particular that our government isn't doing a particularly good job. And this tends to hold true across party lines, although obviously people tend to believe that when their party's in power, they generally have a more optimistic view of government than when the other party's in power. But over time, Congress in particular has become less popular. And so I don't know exactly how well you can see this. This shows you what percentage of people, when asked in a poll, approved of the job that Congress was doing. And you can see that in 1974, and remember, this is right after Watergate, it's 37%, which is not particularly high. And it kind of stays in that 30-degree territory. It improves a little bit in Ronald Reagan's presidency. Drops all the way down to 18% in the early 90s, then kind of climbs up through the rest of the 90s. Actually, it looks like in 2000 it was 56%. I think maybe this is 2001, right after September 11th, when there's kind of this brief moment of political unity. And then you see ever since it has not been a fun ride for Congress's popularity. After hitting that high water mark, it's been down and down, and now in the last few years, and this only goes to 2014, I don't think it's rebounded much since then, but in that 2010 to 2014, it was really plumbing the depths, with 14 and 15% approval rating being the last margins recorded for Congress. So people pretty consistently over the last, 10, 20 years have said that Congress is doing a really bad job. So why? I mean, remember, these people get their jobs by us voting for them. So, why do either we keep voting for the people who are doing a really bad job, or why do the people we're voting for keep doing a bad job? Why do we not think that they're doing a very good job? And I think that there are some reasons about this, some reasons that are really interesting, some ways that politics have kind of changed in the last few years, and I'm going to take you through some of those. One of the things that we can actually track is how many laws Congress has passed. And you remember I said last week that the number of laws passed by Congress is, tiny compared to the number of bills introduced. But the number of laws passed compared to other Congresses has actually gone down. You see that the 84th Congress there, this was shortly after World War II. I think that's actually the early 1950s, maybe they passed more than 1,000 laws in their 2-year period. And so that's, quite a lot. You can see it stays up there, kind of between 500 and 800 for quite a long time. And then starting about with the 108th Congress, it really starts to take a dive. It goes down, down, down. And then in the 113th Congress, it really crashed. And it really hasn't recovered a lot since then. So, even from a data perspective, you can see Congress has been less productive. They've passed fewer laws. And while the dates don't exactly match up, if you kind of slid these two graphs over to have them match up, what you'd actually see is that Congress tends to be more popular when it passes more laws, which is kind of an interesting thing. So why then have they been less productive? There's a few challenges to lawmaking that have emerged. And the first one I'm going to talk about is what's called divided government. Since the start of Ronald Reagan's presidency in 1981, there have been 10 years where one party controlled the presidency, the House, and the Senate. They had total control. We actually just experienced 2 of those years from 2017 to 2019. Right after Trump was elected, Republicans controlled the presidency, obviously, and they also controlled the House and the Senate. But we've had 29 years, it's going to be 30 years, where control of government was divided. And I say it's going to be 30 years because this is the 30th year. It'll switch over early in 2021, depending on what happens in the election this fall. But 29 years where control was divided. So at least one of those 3 kind of sections, the presidency, the House, or the Senate, was controlled by a different party than controlled the other 2. And so you can imagine that makes it harder to pass laws. You have to deal with the other side. If you have total control, you don't have to deal with the other side. Yeah, maybe they can, kick up a dust storm in the Senate and slow things down to a crawl, but usually a majority in the Senate can slowly but surely force their bill through. As we saw, I think, I'll talk about it later, but the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, is a good example. The Democrats only had, I think, 58 votes in the Senate, so they had a majority, but they didn't have a supermajority. So I think the 42 Republicans that were there were able to, make a fit, but they were not able to ultimately stop the bill from being passed. And so if you have divided government, you have a harder time passing bills than you do if you have an undivided government. The other thing is greater partisan division. It used to be that while the Republican Party, if you go back way into like the early 1900s, back into the 1800s, the parties have actually kind of flipped ideologically. The Republican Party used to actually be at least somewhat more liberal than the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party used to be more conservative. That's obviously no longer the case. And really, it's since the 1930s, it's more or less fit into its, 2 sides, with the Democratic Party being a more liberal party and the Republican Party being a more conservative party, but it wasn't always as clear-cut as it was today. As late as the 1980s, you could still find at least a handful of relatively liberal Republicans, and you would find actually quite a few conservative Democrats. And really those conservative Democrats still were a force in the party into the 1990s. But since then, those groups have really kind of been eliminated. They've retired. Geographic shifts have led to greater concentrations of one ideological viewpoint in one party. And so now today, the Republican Party has gotten significantly more conservative, and the Democratic Party has gotten significantly more liberal and more uniformly liberal. And so you don't really have a whole lot of interplay. It used to be that liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats could come together and make up enough of the House or Senate that they could kind of bring their parties to an agreement. It might not have been everybody's cup of tea, but at least it was a law. Now that's really hard. You can, think about trying to make a compromise on something, that's more easy to understand. Let's say that I only want anchovies on my pizza, and you want, anything but anchovies on your pizza. Well, it's hard to compromise then. And that's what we have. There's no overlap in the ideological viewpoints of the parties. What the Democrats want is the exact opposite of what Republicans want. And so between divided government and partisan division, this has made compromise essential, but increasingly difficult to achieve. And that is why you see Congress being less and less productive. So why have the parties moved over so much? And there are a lot of reasons, and perhaps some of it reflects shifts in society. The point I'll make is that political research has revealed that there's relatively few voters in the middle. You might think that you win an election by winning the middle. If you're a Republican, you know that the conservative voters, the real hardcore conservatives, are going to vote for you because they're going to vote for a Republican. They're not going to vote for a Democrat. And you know that the hardcore liberal voters are going to vote for your Democratic opponent. But you think, okay, the way that I win is I go after those people in the middle, those people who are kind of leaning either way, and I make the point that I am, better able to serve their needs than my opponent. Actually, no, it doesn't work like that. People thought it worked like that for a long time, but as we've gotten more scientific with our political research, what we discovered is that the number of people who are in the middle, who aren't part of either party, and routinely switch between voting for a Democrat one year and voting for a Republican the next, is a relatively small number. So why does one party win an election one year and then the other party wins the election the other year? It actually has to do with turnout. What percentage of their base, the people who would likely vote for them anyways, actually comes out and votes. And so what happens is that you win elections not by persuading the middle, but by exciting your base, by getting those, again, if you're a Republican, by getting those hardcore conservatives excited that you are really going to follow hardcore conservative viewpoints when you're elected. And likewise, for Democrats, they get elected by really getting their voters to turn out. And so what that means is that there's less incentive for voters to even appear to be compromising, to even appear to be reaching out, because that's not a winning electoral strategy. The winning electoral strategy is to go back on your basic principles and get your side excited about that. And that's also mean that once we actually get these people in Congress, congressional leadership, not wanting to be embarrassed, has become more restrictive on allowing votes. And so it used to be that if you were able to cobble together a majority of people in Congress, you could usually say, hey, party leader, maybe a majority of our party doesn't like this, but can we still have a vote on it? Now you can absolutely not do that. Especially in the House, a majority of the majority party has to like the idea for it to have any chance of seeing a vote. If there is no support in them, or if there's not majority support in the majority party, then your bill will never even see a vote, even if you could probably get a majority of all the people in Congress to vote for it. So think about the House of Representatives right now. It's got 200-something Democrats and 100-something Republicans. Let's imagine that you were able to cobble together a bill that had 90% of the Republicans and 40% of the Democrats voting for it. Well, that's easily over 50% of Congress. So you'd say, okay, this bill is going to pass for sure. But you're never going to see a vote, because the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, will never allow a vote if only 40% of her party, the party that's in power, that's in the majority, wants it to see a vote. And Republicans have won, when Republicans have run the House of Representatives, they've tend to run it the same way. And so that, again, adds another roadblock to actually getting bills, is that only bills that, have this particular viewpoint ever even see the light of day. Another reason that there have been fewer bills is what I'm going to call Congress's abdication of legislative authority. To some extent, Congress doesn't want to make laws. You might think that's crazy. Why would you run for Congress if it wasn't to make laws? Increasingly, legislation has been fraught with electoral risk. What legislators really want is they want to be reelected. They want to continue to be legislators. And remember, they don't have any term limits, so they can be reelected again and again and again. What if you're a legislator, and you're a relatively popular legislator, you've got a good chance to be reelected, but you suddenly pass a law that has unintended impacts, that the law you passed caused a health crisis, or a law that you passed caused pollution in your district, or caused an industrial accident in which people were hurt or killed. That could jeopardize your chance of being reelected. And so people in Congress have been really worried about, oh gosh, I don't want to pass something that might be perceived as bad, right? I don't want to make tough decisions that might have negative outcomes because it could be bad for my career. Let somebody else make the tough decisions. And Congress has had a hard time making tough decisions also because legislation has gotten more complex. As the world has gotten more complex, the government has had to get more complex to deal with it. Situations like the environment, military and foreign policy, the economy, these are complex issues that really are only understood by people who've spent their lives studying these issues. And you might think that those people were the people in Congress, but they're not. The number one occupation that people have before going into Congress is that of lawyer. And most of these people were either lawyers or they were, people who worked in political operations. Occasionally you'll get people who break that mold, but for the most part, these people are not environmental scientists. They're not doctors or public health experts. Increasingly fewer of them are veterans. Relatively few of them were former military officers or military leaders, and very few of them are economists. So how can we expect them to understand bills that are thousands of pages long and deal with complex regulations and mechanisms for changing the economy or regulating the environment? And the short answer is we can't. And so in order to, the Affordable Care Act, again, this is Obamacare, was 2,300 pages long. And I'm not saying whether it was a good bill or a bad bill. I'm just saying who the heck has time to read 2,300 pages? That's a lot. And so for the most part, people are voting on these laws without even understanding what they mean. And you can understand why there would be a reticence to vote on anything that was real specific in that case, anything that would have real lasting consequences, if you didn't even if you hadn't even had the opportunity to figure out what that was. In many cases, people in Congress rely on outsiders, especially lobbyists, to basically give them legislation and say, hey, put this bill into the hopper and get it passed. Make sure you vote for this, and my interest group will support you. And those interest groups can be all kinds of things, from businesses to labor unions to advocates for a variety of things. Obviously, I think a lot of people are familiar with the National Rifle Association, which supports gun rights. There's other interest groups that support, increasing restrictions on guns. And these groups kind of go to different legislators, and they tend to know which ones are going to support their views and try to, encourage them to support what they want to happen on various laws, oftentimes with the implicit, although not if it was explicit, it would be illegal, but with the implicit understanding that support for or, support against a given piece of legislation will be rewarded by contributions in cash to that legislator's campaign. Legislators, at the end of the day, they don't want to lose elections, though, because people didn't like the laws that they pass, or because they pass laws that they didn't even understand. So what do they do instead? Well, A, they don't pass laws, and B, when they do pass laws, those laws are vague. They're non-specific. They give power to the president and the bureaucracy to really flesh out the details and make the tough decisions. So with all this put together, how is Congress, a Congress which is increasingly divided, between itself and the presidency, and trying to pass laws of incomprehensible complexity, supposed to legislate? And the short answer is that they don't. And this is why they're so unpopular, because they get very little done now. Increasingly, the process on how a bill has become a law has totally broken down. Few laws ever even make it out of their committee, and fewer still are scheduled for floor votes. Lawmakers, generally speaking, spend their time in Congress trying to outmaneuver each other politically. And their hope is that they'll get an opportunity at undivided government, that they'll get that period when they control the Senate, the House, and the presidency, because that's the one time they think they can get anything done. And when they get that opportunity, they then try to pass a whole bunch of laws very quickly, pushing bills through the committee process, oftentimes at breakneck speed, to get it on the floor and pass it with a party line vote. And you're thinking, gosh, that sounds like a really sloppy way to make laws. You're not wrong. Because these laws are often vague, or worse, they're riddled with mistakes, they're often open to court challenge. You see these laws getting challenged in court, the constitutionality. You see states suing the federal government saying these laws aren't constitutional, we can't be forced to follow these laws. And these laws are often highly dependent on the president to enforce through executive action and bureaucratic rulemaking, meaning that if you have a different president, maybe a president who doesn't like that law as much, that law oftentimes can really be weakened through presidential action without that law ever being repealed, which would take a vote of Congress. And so all these things really combined to gum up the works of legislating in the way that our government and our Constitution works. If we had a parliamentary system, which I'm not necessarily saying we should, there's disadvantages to those too, but a parliamentary system, the prime minister, by definition, has the support of a majority of people in parliament. And so that makes the process of writing laws very easily. That generally speaking, the majority in parliament can just pass these laws, and the prime minister can do what's necessary to put them into effect. And with our American system, where you've got, Congress, which is divided into two houses, and the presidency, and, a different party can control any of those three kind of aspects of lawmaking, and with the things that we've talked about, gumming up the works, it's really slowed our process of lawmaking down. And you can understand then why people are frustrated that there seem to be all of these issues of, really extreme importance to our country to try to fix, and yet Congress continues to sit on their hands year after year doing very little. This has not been the most optimistic lecture in the world, I realize that, but I think it was an important one, and I think a relevant one. I hope you've learned something from this, and hopefully you guys can take some notes on the note sheet, and tomorrow we'll have something a little easier, I think. All right, folks, take care. Stay healthy.